Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with How I Discovered Mendelson. Now, I have to confess, my discovery of Mendelson actually happened very, very late. I mean, I knew about him. There were pieces that I enjoyed, but I didn't really understand him. I didn't really find myself interested in what he had achieved and what he was about, and I didn't know about most of it until until I wrote a book about him, which was, I'm shamelessly promoting this, which was fairly recently. When was this thing, was sucker published? It was just a few years ago, I think. Yeah, 2020. Look at that. So it's taken me a long time to come to terms with Mendelson, in spite of the fact that I love certain pieces of his. Of course, the Midsummer Night's Dream, the Italian Symphony, the Scottish Symphony, things like that I knew. And of course, the Hebrides Overture. I discovered Mendelson, like many of us did, through cartoons, because the Hebrides Overture was used as the music in zillions of them, including there was a cool little Halloween cartoon. I don't remember what it was. It was like a Warner Brothers thing. And it started, ya-da-da-da-dum, bum, ya-da-da-da-dum, bum. So I knew it. It was in my head. And the Wedding March, of course, from Midsummer Night's Dream, I knew it was Mendelssohn's Wedding March. I didn't know who Mendelson was. I wasn't thinking much of wedding marches when I was like 7 years old. But I loved that motive that opened the Hebrides. Wow. We didn't get to hear much more than that. Or Fingal's Cave, as it was sometimes called. And, it was on classical compilations and things like that. So, yeah, that was sort of around. And then the Italian Symphony in Eugene Ormandy's recording, which was absolutely lovely. And the Midsummer Night's Dream music, the actual Midsummer Night's Dream music didn't cross my threshold till considerably later. And I had no idea that had written so much music. I remember when I was practicing piano, when I was theoretically learning how to play piano. That's the cat. We don't want to know what she's doing over there. Anyway, when I was learning how to play the piano, there was this thing called Spring Song. I had no idea who wrote it. Not a clue. I just knew I knew the tune. I mean, it was also in cartoons. It was a simplified version of the actual thing. It's one of the songs without words by Mendelson. And when I found out Mendelson wrote it, oh gosh, that was like 20 years later. I just knew the tune. So Mendelson was always out there. I mean, he wrote Christmas carols, all kinds of stuff, right? And he's part of the atmosphere, the air that we breathe musically. Certain works, but very, very few. And my attitude toward Mendelson was later conditioned by reading critics like Tovey and people who basically treated him as a kind of a fop, as a spoiled rich kid who had sucked up to the Victorian establishment, which was a very, very, very untrue portrait of who he actually was and what he really did. I mean, he was the greatest child prodigy since Mozart. He might have been the equal of him. And the fact that he got along well with people, that he wrote for his own time and his society, that's not a crime. I mean, what matters is the quality of what he wrote. And the quality of what he wrote is often extraordinary. There were so many works that I didn't know anything about. So I decided, as I often did, that Mendelson needed a book. And because I had to write a book, I had to listen to everything I could get my hands on. And I discovered this enormous range and repertoire that I had no idea. I mean, the string symphonies, which are fantastic. The earlier symphonies no one pays any attention to, like number 1, which I just adore, and the coda of which makes a fabulous ringtone, by the way. I mean, the Lobgesang, which I was taught to detest. Really, we're taught these things, because people hold them in a certain contempt. And of course, the fact that Mendelson was Jewish, or his family was Jewish, he was a Lutheran, of course, but the fact that his family was Jewish counted against him throughout the 19th century, and also led to his dismissal by much of the critical fraternity. And I remember very, very clearly, I went to a symposium in Italy. And at that symposium, there were several Mendelson scholars. And I remember thinking to myself, who the hell would want to be a Mendelson scholar? What is there to be scholarly about in talking about Mendelson? And what a fool I was. Totally, totally ridiculous, because there's tremendous amounts of first of all, his life was very interesting. I mean, it really was. And because of his talent and his ability and the people he hung out with and his relations with other composers. One of my favorite Mendelson stories is actually a Berlioz story, because Mendelson was a bit of a prude, and he was, very serious about himself and about music. And he wrote some fairly nasty things about Berlioz, even though he played Berlioz's music. I mean, he's willing to do it. And Berlioz thought they were kind of friends, and Mendelson said Berlioz is out of his mind. He has no idea just how ridiculous he is. I mean, he actually wrote this, and Berlioz got wind of it and thought it was just amusing. He thought it was very funny. But the best story is when Berlioz and Mendelson were in Rome together, and they were walking down the Spanish Steps having a big argument about religion, because Berlioz was a complete unbeliever and Mendelson had become was a committed Lutheran for his entire life. And he was talking about providence and fate and predestination. It was a very serious conversation. And Mendelson slipped and went tumbling down the Spanish Steps, and Berlioz ran down after him and picked him up and dusted him off and said to him, "Observe the workings of providence. I blaspheme and you fall," which I think is just a tremendous line. It's a great story. But he wrote amazing chamber music. I mean, he's one of the great chamber music composers of the 19th century. His string quartets are extraordinary. The early piano quartets, the octet, of course, we all know. But, he was so remarkable at such an early age that nobody gives him credit for writing masterpieces at the age of 12. I mean, they're really much more sophisticated works than, for example, Mozart was writing at the same age. And they are amazing. The string symphonies, I think, I still have to talk about them individually. I really do, because they are amazing pieces. He basically taught himself the history of the symphony in 12 works that make a steady increase in sophistication and complexity and stylistic broadening until he finally gets to his first orchestral symphony, the Symphony for Full Orchestra. And it's just an amazing project. I mean, intellectually, he was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And so getting to know Mendelson has been one of the happiest things of my mature life. And the works that I knew when I was a kid, those few works that I mentioned earlier that I sort of wrote off, I've come to have a completely fresh understanding of them. And like all great composers, like all of them, Mendelson had a language, a certain syntax, a mixture of updated Mozart and Bach with late Beethoven, and just a very interesting combination of things to which he added his own particular gifts for scoring, for orchestration, for harmony. And, there isn't any area in which he worked that he didn't contribute something masterful. Even the oratorios. Oh, wow. Well, St. Paul, okay, I could sort of do without. But Elijah is really quite a terrific piece. I mean, think about it. It's the only sacred oratorio, essentially, from the entire 19th century that anybody cares about, in English. I mean, everyone was writing scads of them. But Elijah was the masterpiece, and so it still is. Really, really a remarkable guy. So, yes, Listening to Mendelson is the book, which, like I said, I'm shamelessly plugging, because I think it does, have something of the wonder of a new discovery about it. And that's what we need to recapture when we listen to Mendelson. We can't treat him as a faded old Victorian ninny. He was not that, and he shouldn't have been treated like that. And his music isn't like that. It isn't like that at all. Not a bit. I mean, yes, it's like Mozart said, it must never offend the ear, no matter how dark or horrible the situation. And his music is like that. It has this desire to be loved, to be ingratiating to the listener, but it's not negligible, and it's not superficial, and it's not mindless or slick. I mean, he revised and revised and revised. He published very few works during his lifetime because he was constantly reworking things. He was incredibly self-critical, and he was a musical genius, and that's okay in my book. So it goes to show that first of all, we shouldn't rely on received opinion, and there is no substitute for actual listening to the music, to the extensive variety of the music of these major composers. And also, I think that there'll be a time. I know some of you have said you dislike certain composers or such and such. I can only say, wait, give it time. If you think that you don't respond to a particular idiom, to a particular composer, and that you should, and it concerns you because other people are telling you that this guy's a flaming genius. How come? What's wrong with you? The answer is there's nothing wrong with you. You may never respond to some of it, but you may also. The key is simply to give it time, and at some point, if it's meant to happen, it's going to happen. The other thing you can do, of course, is write a book about it. That will force you to listen to all of this stuff, and also to have to say good things about it, rather than simply repeat tired old assumptions that you've heard out there, because the out there doesn't always tell us the truth. Not a bit. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Tell me how you first encountered Mendelson. Take care.